pleasant good evening to you. Welcome back to the Small Hours podcast with Russell Cordell Staker. It's nice to have you along. It's been 3 months since our last episode, and I have an interesting essay tonight that I'd like to share with you. The essay, written by me, Russell Cordell Staker, is entitled Soul Coaxing. First, a few brief points of consideration, some of which are vivid memory and others possibly reimagined, but no less authentic, none in any particular order. Dad sings along in natural French to Michel Polnareff. One voice blends in harmony with the scratchy vinyl recording of the other. The creamy sound of the language is beautiful and dreamlike. It soars in articulate and elongated flourishes. Each indecipherable phrase arrives in the nick of time, like making turns on a slippery road. I feel secure, warm with happiness, aware of the joy in the lilt and prayer of my father's cantor. I am curious. With each turn of a page, I scan the structure of writing for dirty sentences in Mario Puzo's The Godfather. I have no idea what I will find. I've only just heard about the book and remember it being sent off early to bed so that my parents can be alone to watch it on the VCR. I do manage to find a few choice sentences that give me the satisfaction of something I'm too young to understand, but more than this is an awareness of the shape and flow of language on the page. I'm drawn to the idea of a man sitting in a room behind a typewriter putting these sentences down. I close the book and take a long, slow look at the broad shelves full of books in front of me. Bright yellow sunlight leans through the window to my right like a slanted pillar, enlivening the deep emerald hue of this mysterious hallway. For the first time in my young life, I know exactly who I am. I know precisely what I am going to do. I lie on a cot in a big canvas tent in Island Park, Idaho, reading verse by Rudyard Kipling. Lifting my voice just above the hissing Coleman lantern, which pours cold light onto the page in front of me, I hear these words. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim, and lose and start again at the beginning, and never breathe a word about your loss, you'll be a man, my son. Many years later, I read these same words again and remember telling myself not ever to forget them. I swim into shadow just beyond the harsh stadium light of the 50-meter pool and tread water 12 feet from the floor. For a moment, I look up at the milky white crescent moon, which hangs like a glow sticker on the ceiling of a pale pre-dawn sky. I am entirely alone, the first into the pristine glass. Reaching down with both hands, I pull the red Speedo from my hips and buttocks, sinking beneath the surface to slither completely out of the suit. I hear myself laughing under the water and return to the surface with the lycra fabric wadded into the fist of my left hand. The 2 staff lifeguards on duty chortle at the far end of the pool, unaware of my nakedness as they half glance in my direction. It feels good to be so wide awake. I swim naked in the dark, undisturbed, for several minutes. I am perfectly slippery in the water. I drive onto the shoulder of northbound US 101 and stop near an auto repair shop outside of Port Angeles, Washington. I am in a terrible state of panic. This might be the end, but the end of what? Am I experiencing a heart attack? I can't be sure. I look in the rearview mirror and see no hurt there. Looking away, I open the car door and slide from the seat onto the ground, where I thrust the tips of my fingers into the loose, tar-scented gravel. I'm not sure why, but I feel like I need to hold on to something, or I might fall forward into the gray sky above. Several cars pass by. I don't care. I hear a faint, distinctive engine outside and get up from the couch where I'm watching Mickey Mouse Clubhouse with my little son. I'll be right back, I say, surprised by a sudden and decisive verdict. I go into the room where I write and pull a book from its shelf. Quickly, I flip through it one last time, scanning highlighted passages and commentary I wrote in the margins some 13 years earlier. The book has merit, but the writer didn't tell the truth, which has always bothered me. I wonder why I've kept it this long. I take the book outside, holding it by the binding, my right index and middle finger extending up its spine in a 4-seam fastball grip. I raise my hand and pitch the book forcibly into the trash can I'd set out the night before. The sound it makes under the power of my throw is a slap, paper thick. Its resonance gives me a great satisfaction and immediate closure. I return to the house where I wait by the window and watch as the big green truck with its mechanical arm grabs hold of the can and raises it high up over its steel container. The contents of the can pour forth like a chunky stew into a pot. I want to see the book drop into it, but can't. "Daddy, what is it?" asks my little son, now right beside me. I take him up into my arms, kiss him on the cheek, and let him see for himself. "Trash truck!" he exclaims. We look at each other with reciprocal O-faces full of exhilaration and then look back out the window and wave at the driver, but he doesn't see us. The truck hisses and whistles as it rolls forward. We watch it go, and then I lower my son to the carpet where he runs down the hall holding a red Lego man high above his head. He issues a sharp jet-like shoosh sound from puckered lips as he turns the corner in a flight of imagination and is gone. My life, no different than any other, is really just a sequence of little moments. Most aren't worth telling. When I sat down to write this morning, I had a different idea in mind about what I was going to say. Writing is the great leveler because when I get into it, I realize I'm just an apprentice to the language and what it has to say. My opinion doesn't really matter. What does matter is how I use the tools in the box to get to the truth. This is always the hard part. In the end, I think I understand what Jack Kerouac meant in the second sentence of his beautiful novel, On the Road. He's right. I won't bother to talk about it. Life is usually a lot of memory about something, and most often it leaves a feeling that everything that happened is now dead. The choice is to find a way to get out of the way of what was, become less aware of myself now, and more aware of the person right in front of me, even when I don't want to. I recently rediscovered the music of Michel Polnareff. It is interesting to listen to songs you haven't heard since childhood. There is a shock of memory which is more felt than understood, and suddenly you realize how quickly you've grown up. The safety net that was once a certainty is gone, and so are your heroes. In my case, Dad has been gone now 4 years. The two songs I remembered best and am now listening to again are as beautiful and pure as ever, but I'm also 25 years older than Dad was when I was watching him sing along to them. Time is a terribly funny and sad thing. It distorts all the lies and truths. Sometimes I forget that I'm singing along to my own songs in French. When I look behind me, I see my kids looking up in my direction, watching me the way I watch Dad. In 1966, Michel Polnareff released his debut album entitled Love Me, Please Love Me. My dad discovered it whilst living in Marseille, France in 1969. He bought the record there and then brought it home in 1970. It is fitting Dad was elegantly fluent in French. His adopted language was always the soft touch to a good and hard life. My earliest memory of listening to the record with Dad is around 1978. I was 4. The title track, Sur quelle étoile suis-je né, never really left me, though I had not heard it in over 3 decades. It took me a while to locate the song and its artist, but when I did, the emotional reward was profound. The clue that led me to the artist was an orchestrated version of another one of Polnareff's songs Dad adored, but for which I did not know the title. That song is called Ame Kaline, entitled Soul Coaxing in English. As it happens, I'm an avid listener of Channel 69 on Sirius XM radio called Escape, and not in the least skittish in admitting this. In fact, it is my favorite channel. Escape is a consortium of orchestrated, contemporary, easy listening, usually dubbed grocery store music, and always perfectly effervescent and delightful to listen to. I rely on it daily. Every so often, I would hear an arrangement of a particular song that was somewhat obvious to me, but for some reason, I'd never made the direct connection to its source. One morning, about a year after Dad died, I was driving my Impala and listening to Channel 69 when Soul Coaxing came on. The song's rendition was by the French composer Raymond Lefebvre. The melody struck like a force of electricity, and suddenly it all came back. This was one of Dad's songs. When I got to where I was going, I parked the car and then clicked YouTube on my iPhone to perform a search, and in a matter of seconds, there was Michel Polnareff in a black and white video from 1967 singing Ame Kaline. From there, I found the cover of the album I'd long forgotten but subconsciously remembered so well. The song Soul Coaxing was released the following year in 1967. Dad had a copy of that single on a 78 vinyl, and I always remembered him switching out the spacer and stylus from a 33 to a 78 on the record player before spinning it. I wish I had his old copies of those vinyl records, but they are now long gone. I still remember the way they smelled in their sleeves. Recently, I sold suits at Dillard's. One night I was feeling particularly low. I had a miserable headache and my feet were in terrible pain. The men's department was a ghost town, but I kept busy anyway and found small comfort in the tinny music streaming from speakers no one would ever want in their home. I rearranged and tagged 2 entire sections of shirts and then organized all of the underwear in the big and tall section. I felt bad thinking about some of the men who needed the sizes I was sorting. After that, I vacuumed the dressing rooms, which were a god-awful mess of hangers and dress pins and piles of discarded shirts, which I then took to the counter and neatly refolded and repinned. All of these tasks required no thought, no intellect, no curiosity. Though I tried to consider a bigger picture, I couldn't help but feel sad inside for doing work that ultimately felt like such a waste of time and of my best energy. I looked up. Over in the corner was a gentleman of simple means with his wife sorting through a round discount rack of suits. I approached and offered to measure him. As it turned out, he wasn't much older than I was, and we spent the better part of an hour together picking out a nice suit and shirt and tie for a job interview at a car dealership. He had been laid off and out of work for some time. We both laughed about the turns life takes and the nobility of just doing what you can, when you can. I wished him well and told him maybe one day I'll come and buy a car from him. He said, "I'd like that." And then it was quiet again, but I didn't feel so bad anymore. I had managed to get out of my own way. As I thought about it, no time is ever wasted. The time we have is really all we've got. I am a work in progress, but I am always on my way. RCS, 19 October, 2020. And that, my friends, is the essay for tonight. And as usual, I've got to take a quick drink, so hang on one second. It's been 3 months since I last produced an essay that I've recorded on this podcast. And in some ways, I think it's a really good thing because I realize I'm more alone now than ever. But I am delighting in the work that's happening. This has been a really pleasurable essay to come to, and it took a long time to consider. But it also took a long time because I'm still finishing up my novel. And the goal, of course, is to have that thing ready so that I can send it out into the world by the end of this year. So I've decided that this podcast, it's taking on a new form for me, which is good. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here at the very end as I share a few thoughts about the essay that I wrote and the transition that I'm taking in my own literary craft and the anticipation of what will be in 2021. So I took some notes as a sidebar track to many of the things that I wrote about in this essay that will add some color to this. And I do want to walk through some of this because I think it's, for me personally, this is a track of my own discovery as a writer. And that's the big reason why I am producing this podcast. And for anybody who's stuck with me, this is now the 6th episode. The intent of the podcast is not to toot my own horn in a way of stating something that I'm trying to build this huge followership right now. It's more or less an opportunity for me to echo test the work that I'm doing. And of course, along the way, open the door for those that will potentially listen, may potentially have some feedback, but ultimately, if it's something that's positive and it builds a quorum of impact in terms of what language can do, and at least my effort in providing it, then I think it's quite possibly a very good thing. So right now, I don't have any grand anticipation, but I feel that it's really accelerating and sharpening my own strength as a writer. I want to talk first of all about Michel Polnareff, who, by the way, is still living. He is a French artist. And I had notes down on where he's actually from in France, and unfortunately it's not in front of me right now, but you can certainly Google it. And I would highly suggest that you please look up his debut novel or debut album, Love Me, Please Love Me, and its title track, Sur quelle étoile je suis né. And I actually just mispronounced that. I butchered it because I don't have it in front of me, but that track is magic. And My memory of Michel Polnareff is of my dad listening to those records. My dad lived in France for a period of 2 years, and he was beautifully fluent in French. And through the remainder of his life, I would often be with my dad. We'd be in random places like a grocery store or Disneyland or wherever, and inevitably my dad would run into somebody from France or from Canada, it didn't matter, or wherever French is spoken, and he would just get into French, and it was beautiful to listen to him talk, and he was very good at it, and I knew it because he engaged very well with the people that he talked to. In 1978, I was 4, and that's one of my earlier memories, not my first. I have memories as far back as right at the end of my second year and going into my third year. But for me, the video clip, if you will, of my mind really comes into full picture in 1978 when I was 4. And one of the predominant memories is of my dad listening to Michel Polnareff in the front room of our little house on Beach Street in Caldwell, Idaho. It was just in the family room, and he had this wooden hutch that he had made, and it was an interesting piece of furniture. And there was a record player on it with speakers. My dad had some really nice speakers. I remember that because it really put out some great sound. And the scratchy quality, which everybody loves in vinyl, was it was elegant. It just had it had an old-fashioned sound to it. And I knew I was listening to something that was older. It's funny, everything's relative. In 1978, this song wasn't that old. But to me, it sounded like it was 50 years old. And it was just beautiful. And to me, it captured the elegance of my father. He was a mystery to me in some ways, as all fathers are to their sons or their daughters, because he could sing along. He had a beautiful singing voice. He had a beautiful speaking voice, and he spoke beautiful French that matched this very elegant, articulate, sing-songy Frenchman who was singing about something I just didn't understand, and it was remarkable. It's interesting because in that house, that was also the house that I remember in, I believe it was 1980 when John Lennon was murdered in New York City. I came home from school the day that he died, and this is just a segue, but it kind of ties itself to this memory of Michel Polnareff. So this is a couple years later. And I remember coming into the house and my mother being in the same room right by the record player. We had a little TV on just the opposite end of where the record player was. Dad wasn't home yet from work. He worked at a newspaper. He was an ad director for I think it was the Caldwell Tribune, if I remember. Maybe it was the Statesman, but it was the local newspaper there. Anyway, he wasn't home yet from work, and my mom was sitting on the couch with the TV on, and I believe it was CBS News. At least that's my memory. And I overheard that John Lemon had been shot. And my mom turned to me and she said, John Lennon is dead. But again, I kept hearing the word lemon, as in like the fruit. And I didn't put the connection together. Now, in our home, music was a very big part of my growing up. So music was no different than also books that I was coming in touch with. So I had an articulation of a lot of groups. I was very familiar with the Beatles, but I hadn't made the connection with who John Lennon was, of course, but I thought that it was this man named John Lemon who had died. And I will never forget how distraught my mom looked. It was very troubling, and I was curious about any man with a last name of Lemon. So an interesting connection that also every time I hear Michel Polnareff, and even now, I think of John Lennon because of the proximity of that memory. The second memory that comes into play, the consideration that I talk about in my essay, it takes place, it would have been in the summer of 1984, and this is actually in Pleasant Grove, Utah. Upstairs in my grandmother Driggs' house, we called her Grammy. And she had this elegant, beautiful house that to me was a house of mystery and magic. And it was kind of a haunted house, in my opinion. It was beautiful. It was surrounded by these elegant, lovely, thick, groved cherry trees, which are still a big part of that part of Utah. As it is today, I've been to the house. My Grammy Driggs she's been dead now since, I believe, 2002. So when I've seen the house in recent years, if I'm with my daughter up in Salt Lake and we drive down to Pleasant Grove, it's really depressing to see the house because all of those beautiful cherry trees have been chopped down and the house just looks really bad. But as a kid, it was beautiful and it was very mysterious and magical. And on my mom's side of the family, it's a very literary family. My great-grandfather was one of the founders of Southern Utah University in Cedar City, Utah. His name was Howard Roscoe Driggs. And one of his sons was my grandfather, my mom's dad, and he was H. Wayne Driggs, and he was later the director, or as it would be known, the president of Southern Utah University. And then they had their children, and this house was a repository of a lot of these books that existed, as well as the writing desk of my grandfather, and there were things in there from my great-grandfather. So the house was, to me, it was a magical house of letters, because on that side of the family, I come from a long line of both English professors, if you will, and historians, as well as writers. But there was just this elegance of books. And my grandmother, in her own right, she had a master's degree, I believe, in education, and she was extremely well read. So there were books upstairs and downstairs, and she was a world traveler, and there were all of these little knickknacks and things in their house that, little Buddhas and whatever. It was just this confluence of beautiful cacophony that to me was so discordant from the simplified Mormon version of the life that I was also raised in. I'm a native Mormon. I'm no longer Mormon, but when I would go to her house, to me, nothing really segged up. There was, in her fridge, she had a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label whiskey, which I'd sip from now and then. And I didn't like the taste of it, and I just didn't realize I was going to like it a lot later in life. But upstairs, as I'm writing about it, was this green hall. And on this particular afternoon, I was looking at Mario Puzo's book, The Godfather. And I won't get into, obviously, what I wrote about in the essay, but the point being in that moment was I just had this great sense of language, and it was so inspiring. And I made a promise to myself, more than anything, that I was going to read every book in that house. And I don't know that I would have actively said I'm going to turn into a writer someday, but that was there as well. And it was a very clear moment, and something that I still look back on, and it's a wonderful memory, because I would have been 10, 11, and I already knew who I was. Doesn't matter how hard life's been, and I certainly am still figuring this out, but man, I'll tell you what, I knew early on who I was. The next little sequence is a moment that I take from the summer of 1990 in a place called Island Park, Idaho. It's not far from West Yellowstone, West Yellowstone, or Yellowstone Park. Beautiful place there. I worked summers in camp. It was a Boy Scout camp. And I did a lot of reading during that time. Of course, I was a very avid reader very early on in life, but I remember by the summer of 1990, I was really getting into heavy literature. I was reading a lot of stuff. And I remember I had a book of verse from Rudyard Kipling among many, many other books I was reading. I was listening very heavily to the Smiths at the time. So Morrissey and Johnny Marr were kind of the sequence of music on the backdrop to a lot of the reading that I was doing that particular summer. And of course, Depeche Mode has always been a huge part. So it's interesting. My literary fixation is also tied to a lot of the sonic synth pop that was also filtering into my world at that time, as well as classic rock. And I'm going to just convey one little brief instance with that is I was also getting heavily into Pink Floyd. And to this day, my favorite Pink Floyd album is I think it was 1973, Wish You Were Here album. I believe it came, and I'm getting the dates wrong. I apologize. I should know this better. But the Wish You Were Here is my favorite record. And there are multiple parts of my favorite song, which is called Shine On You Crazy Diamond. And I remember I would do a lot of deep reading in this big canvas platform tent. And when the sun would go down, I would take my Walkman and I would walk out from the tent just far enough to get away from the camp and be alone. And, it's this beautiful camp area. You're up in the hills a little bit, a lot of lodgepole pine trees and grassy knolls. And I lay in the thick grass and I would look up at the stars. And at night, as anybody's done, when you're out under the stars in a mountainous place, it's like you can touch heaven. And I'd click the on button on my Walkman and listen to Pink Floyd's Shine On You Crazy Diamond. And the guitar from David Gilmour, oh man, it still just gets to me. I mean, I've never done hard drugs and I haven't needed to, because that just takes me to a transcendental place that is beyond anything. And I remember the distinctive sense, if I concentrated enough listening to that music, looking up into the stars, and then considering words like I'd read from Rudyard Kipling, I felt as if I might fall forward into the stars and be lost. And it would actually scare me, and I'd have to turn the music off and go back to my tent and do something else. So a little memory there. The next sequence that I talk about is actually swimming. This is much later in life. This would have been between 2005 and 2007. For 2 years, in that particular moment, I lived in Thousand Oaks, California. I was an oncology drug rep for the company Amgen, and I got a job there from a senior vice president who I just adored and looked up to, and she'd been at my former company, Eli Lilly and Company, and then she brought me along with her to work at Amgen. And as it was, I had a different role, and then I got promoted into this hospital sales role. The only reason I'm mentioning this as context is that I was listening a lot to Coldplay's X and Y album, which had come out in 2005. And I was a triathlete, and I've mentioned that in one of my earlier podcasts, and really fit, active guy. And I would get up at 4:30 in the morning, and I would drive down from Thousand Oaks into Simi Valley, and I would go to the Rancho Simi community pool there, and I would swim. And I would swim for an hour, sometimes longer, before I would go back and get ready for the day to go into work. And sometimes I would swim, and then I would bring my running shoes, and I'd go run after. I was pretty hardcore. But I remember some mornings I would be there first thing in the morning, and the pool was an Olympic distance pool. It was a 50-meter pool. It was half salt water, half chlorine. It was a beautiful pool out in the open, again, under the stars. And, Southern California, of course, is great, even in the wintertime. It gets cold. It really did. It's cold, but the pool temperature was just right. And I'd get in that water and I'd swim out to about the halfway point. And the pool is, what I loved about it was it started shallow, but it had a really nice deep end. I think it got beyond actually 12 feet, and I'm probably embellishing, but I know it was around 12 feet at the back end. Because I think they did have a high dive in there. But at about the halfway point of the pool, you'd get out from underneath the early morning stadium lights, and it was just dark. And the two girls that typically, ran the pool, there was a guy there too, but it was typically two girls. And by the way, I'm not mentioning this. There was no prurient, perverse activity on my part. I had no interest in being discovered. It was an act of liberation, but I would swim out from under those stadium lights to the dark part of the pool, and they knew I was an active triathlete, so they didn't really pay much attention to me, and I was always there. And I would peel off that Speedo, and I'd go swim on the back end of that pool for sometimes as long as 10, 15 minutes before the next person arrived. Now, if I got there and somebody was there, I wasn't doing it, but there was something about that just felt so rebellious. And I looked forward to it. It was actually part of what got me out of bed so early, is I knew I was going to go skinny dipping in this big community Olympic pool, which gave me a lot of courage to go sell these oncologic therapeutics in LA County Hospital and the Keck School of Medicine at the USC campus. I was a hospital rep for Amgen, and that was a tough job to have to stand in front of oncologists as they're doing grand clinical rounds. And, here I am, a guy that studied Shakespeare, and I'm going toe to toe with these doctors that have been in school forever. So that was that point. The next one that comes along is a dark moment, which is just a few short years later. This would have been in mid to late May of 2008. And I was confronted with what I later named Linda. I gave her this name, and I'm not going to get into why, but I had my first terribly severe panic attack. And without getting into the details, I'm going to touch on Jack Kerouac here in a moment, because none of the proverbial or quotidian sins of my life have anything to do with it, although at the time you think, well, I'm going through this trauma because, my life's falling apart. The bottom line in the end stage here is that I was a good-hearted guy, but I was coming up on some massive change in my life. It was my Franz Kafka, Gregor Samsa moment of metamorphosis. I just didn't know it. And I was on my way up to Port Angeles. I lived in Gig Harbor at the time. At this point, I'm working for Eli Lilly and Company as a psychiatric MD and nurse ARNP specialist representative, selling all forms of antidepressants, atypical antipsychotics, male erectile dysfunction. I had a whole bag of medicine that I hauled up and down the Olympic Peninsula. And on this particular morning, I was just under a lot of duress. But what happened was, and it had been building for a number of years, my body just said enough. And the way it evolved was I had a massive panic attack, but I had no idea what was happening to me. I thought I was having a heart attack. For a few years after, I actually thought I'd had a nervous breakdown. None of those things really are the case. What I learned later and know about myself is that my form of depression comes in a hyper state of anxiety. And it's something that I've dealt with actually, and I didn't realize it, but I was dealing with it ever since I was a little boy. And as I've gotten older in life, I know how to deal with it, but I spent a good a good decade. From that point on, particularly going through severe turbulence. Went on to some medication for a while. I was misdiagnosed as being some form of mentally ill. I'm not going to get into that right now, which I was not. What I was dealing with were some very, very big tectonic plate shifts going on in my life. And we as human beings were vulnerable, and there are moments where you can only take so much, and then a breakdown occurs. And that's what happened with me. And it was devastating. It was a very terrible, hard thing to have to deal with. And as I described it too, what really took place more than anything else was finally I was aware of the shift that I knew was coming, and I had to start addressing some things, which I did. The next consideration is me describing throwing a book in the trash. Now, let me say something about that. I love books and actually treat books with great reverence and respect. So the idea of throwing a book actually in the trash and not giving it away, let's say if I were to go to a Goodwill store, is anathema to who I am, because typically I would. But in this case, this was a book that, like most of my books in my library, when I've read them, they are marked up. They become very personal because I put a lot of my soul into those books. And there was a lot of personal commentary in this particular book. I'm not actually going to mention who the book was written by or what the book was, the title, because I think that would be, it would come across as self-serving, and that's not my point. What I wanted to describe is that, and this goes for both fiction and nonfiction, when a writer makes a choice not to tell the truth, the reader knows. And I'm an adept reader. I've been reading my whole life, and there are a lot of books that I've read that I know the writer didn't tell the truth. And for those out there that may not read a lot, they may say, well, wait a minute, I thought fiction is, that's pretend. And that's actually not true. Fiction has to tell the truth as well. It can be imagined, but it has to tell the truth. Nonfiction is no different. Nonfiction is, factual on events and times and whatever, but the truth also has to be there in the nuance. And when it's not, it's propaganda. And this particular book was propaganda. It was actually a nonfiction book, and it was a somewhat religious history book tied to my former faith. That's all I'm going to say. It served a purpose at a time as I was really coming through the ether of things I already knew for myself that were quite obvious. And I was grateful for the book because it added a little more texture. But as I continued on in my pursuit of real history and nuance and understanding, I realized that this guy was hedging. And it made me very mad. And yet I'd maintained this book. It had resonance on my bookshelf for over 13 years. And when I had that desire, it was just a very sudden thing. I'm sitting in the front room with my little son, and I was like, no, I'm not keeping that book in my library, and I got rid of it. And it was a moment of great clarity and closure, and I'm glad it's gone, because I have other books in my library that did tell the truth in this particular avenue or theater of history, and I'm grateful for that. I'm going to read, let me go to Jack Kerouac now. By the way, his novel On the Road, which was published in 1957, I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize. And it really doesn't matter because in my mind, it should have won the Nobel Prize and everything else. It is one of the most profound books I've ever read in my life. And I've read it, let's see, how many times have I read this book? Well, I always put little notes in the beginning. I've read this particular paperback copy 5 times. But I think I've read this book baker's dozen. I don't know. I'm going to read the second sentence that I referred to. So this is Jack Kerouac. Second sentence of his novel, and that's all I'm going to read. I had just gotten over a serious illness that I won't bother to talk about, except that it had something to do with the miserably weary split up and my feeling that everything was dead. That sentence to me has come back so many times, and as I'm getting better with the craft of my own writing, one of the things that I'm learning is that writing for me, it's 2 parts. The first part is not saying too much. And in fact, what's most important is to use language to say what only really truly needs to be said. And in a way, you're partnering with the reader to help fill in some of the more obvious blanks. And the second thing is that I really don't like the idea of expose writing. And I knew as I started writing these essays, for those that may worry, there are some maybe that might know me, that may think, oh, I'm going to start writing about all these deep, dark secrets. Not that I have a whole lot of those, but that's not what the purpose of any writer really is about. I believe that writing, much like what I think Jack Kerouac is alluding to there, and again, this is my personal take on just that one sentence, is that there are a lot of things in our life, much like some of the considerations that I'm bringing up, that are they're just little tastes, and that's about all we really need, because the traumas, the overarching dilemmas that we're facing, and the things in the moment that we think are just so cataclysmic and that they're, we're never going to forget. The further on down the road that you get from those, you realize they really, they're valuable, but they really didn't matter. What matters is the language that you carry with you, and the stuff that it's like a resonance of, yeah, I experienced that. And, it's changed the way I think about something, or maybe it's mellowed me out a little bit more. My wife tells me all the time, I like you better when you're chill, when you're mellow. And I have my moments when I'm really chill. And then I'm an intense guy too. And as I just mentioned, I deal with anxiety. It's something that comes up because I'm quite fastidious and organized and very goal-oriented and task-oriented, and I put a lot of pressure on myself, and there's things that I want to achieve as well. But anyway, there's this balance, and I think with writing, that's important. And in writing fiction or nonfiction, you only need to say so much, and that's what I'm really striving to do. And again, this will be a lifelong pursuit, but that's something that really stuck out for me with Jack Kerouac, and still does. It's about getting out of the way, getting out of your own way, so that you're not so focused on yourself, but maybe the person in front of you. And God knows we need to do a better job of that. I do anyway. The next thing is going back to the idea of Michel Polnareff. And I'm going to say one other thing about my dad here. My dad, he was in southern France from 1968 to 1969. This is at the height of Vietnam. My dad was a tall, 6'2", blonde, handsome American guy, just so full of life. My dad was just magic. And to me, when I see photographs of my father from that time, he looks like a modern day version of the singer Beck. Literally. Pictures of Beck and my dad are one and the same, especially when he's wearing his Ray-Bans. And I see my dad in these tapered suits that he was wearing in France. And so Michel Polnareff, that soundtrack fits that image of my dad just in such an eloquent and elegant, magical way. And I really, really love that. And my dad, he was a big photographer. He was an artist. He'd paint, he carved, he built model airplanes, and he was a wonderful photographer. And throughout his time in Europe, he took just these amazing photographs with old cameras. And I'm not a photographer, so I can't remember. I don't know what kinds of cameras he was using, but he really knew what he was doing. And there was one particular photograph that he took of a beached old boat in Marseille. And Marseille is it's a coastal town. I've never been to Marseille. I have lived in Europe. I speak Dutch and Flemish. I was in Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands, but I never got down into France. And there in Marseille, there's a lot of boats. And there's this picture my dad took of this old beached boat. I'm not sure what kind of boat it was, but it's like sun-drenched and faded, and it's just dried out, and it's tilted on its side on the sand. And my dad got this wonderful photograph, and then he later painted that as well. And I think with Michel Polnareff and me, this is in my mind as I was writing this essay, I was thinking about this idea of soul coaxing, which is the title of Michel Polnareff's song. In life, I think in some respects, we ultimately all end up as that beached boat. And there's this soul coaxing that as we're going through our life and figuring out who we are and really what we're going to do with our lives, regardless, some of the breakdown, some of the transformation, those sorts of things come back around. And that's the salt that I think we're going to hold on to when we leave this life and go wherever we're going next. And that stuck with me. The last little instance before I close out this discussion, or at least retrospective, is me working at Dillard's. And I want to give a little bit of history there. Let me get another quick drink. In 2016, so 4 years ago now, a little over 4 years ago now, I left my former career. At the time, I think I kind of knew, I was kind of like, what would be the description? It's kind of like a spaceman leaving the craft, and he's battening down the hatches. And, once you leave the craft, you're not getting back in. I think I knew that at the time, but I know that now, especially here we are, year of 2020. God, what a year this is. So who knows what's going to come in the next year. But when I left corporate America to pursue writing and take on a different role, and my wife she's amazing with what she does, and I'm not going to get into details. That's her thing. But what I want to say is that I've shifted my direction, And some of it was unknown to me, and some of it was also by choice. The point here is that very shortly after all of that, and I was going through a really big evolution transformation in my own life and figuring out some things. And I want to also say to, my wife and my family, they have been so amazing, so supportive of what I'm doing. And to my dying day, I will always be grateful for the love and support that they give. This has been a bridge that I've had to walk. And during these last 4 years, I've worked various odd jobs along the way while I've been writing, and I've been taking care of kids, and I've been doing a lot of really good things, very busy things that are important and essential to my family, and I provide in ways that are unique now too. So it's a broader panoply of things that I can provide, but it was not what I'd forecasted or planned on when I was a younger man. And this goes back to kind of what I'm talking about through this soul coaxing. Sometimes we are forced into realizing that all the things we really wanted in life, we're going to get them. We just may not like the circumstances to get there. And this is part of what this was. And so one of the jobs that I took for a period of some months was working at Dillard's, which is a wonderful department store. And over the years, I've bought suits from Dillard's. And I ended up as the suit specialist guy at Dillard's in Bee Cave. And I loved working with the people there at Dillard's. They were amazingly good people. And it gave me a real front and center view into retail. I'd never actually worked retail. I waited tables through college. That's a form of retail, if you will. Obviously, that's the food business. I was a good waiter. I was a busser. I was an expediter. I've done all kinds of jobs my whole life. But to be on the back end of what I thought was going to turn out to be this, important career. And I'd spent years in big pharma working for two very, very reputable companies, Eli Lilly and Company for about 10 years off and on. I kind of went back and forth with them a couple of times. I worked for Amgen. I've lived in some amazing places, and I got paid a lot of good money for a while there. I was kind of high, wide, and handsome and on my way to what I was doing. And then I went into high tech, and I worked for Oracle, and I worked for VMware, and I did some interesting things, and I've touched on AI analytics. And so, I've been around the block, and I've actually done some pretty unique things, but I've always been on that sales side. And when a guy in sales, especially as you're getting a little bit older and getting into your 40s, and you step away from that, it's very difficult to get back in. And so I took a job at Dillard's. And for me, the big thing about Dillard's was seeing myself in a different light. And the suits that I would wear when I would go into Dillard's to sell the suits that they had on the racks were suits that were already 10, 12 years old. These were suits that I bought when I was first getting into pharma sales. But I didn't have new suits at that time, and I couldn't afford to buy one myself. So I'm wearing suits that had cuffs, and they were just not the style of what's going on. And I always used to think that's so ironic that here I am, getting on my hands and knees and measuring these guys that are coming in to fit them for brand new suits. And, I'm on my hands and knees and I'm doing a different job. And I was getting a different perspective, a different viewpoint of the world, and always grateful for that, and gracious in the thought that I could still do what I was doing, and I didn't have ego enough to prohibit me from doing that kind of a job. It was a very good job. The hard part is that it demands a huge amount of time for very low pay. And there are so many of us out there in America that's the reality that we face. And I have a deeper respect for the nobility of hard work. I always have. I come from a family of hard workers, and I will always work. I don't anticipate that I'm not going to work. I will do whatever it takes, and I'm not afraid to do any kind of job. And it's a big part of what I write about, and what I'm going to be writing about is I pay attention to the people that are doing those jobs that a lot of times we just skip right over. And I've had the luxury and the opportunity to work them as well. And I've got a handful of those jobs probably coming my way in the next few years until I figure out whatever it is I'm going to do with my writing. So that's what I wanted to touch on. As I close out this episode, I'm going to simply state that this will most likely, unless I surprise myself, be the last podcast for this calendar year. My novel is it's basically written. So the last time we talked was there. I'm going back and I'm editing and I'm putting the final flourishes on some things. The goal is to have this thing ready so that as the year draws to an end, I'm going to start sending it out into the world. So that's where my focus is going to be. But what I wanted to say about this podcast is that when I started this back in May of this year, I think it was May, maybe it was April, I can't remember now. I had a different view for what I thought I was going to do. And I've quickly discovered where I want to take this, and this is the exciting thing that gets me going, is that in a nutshell, these 6 episodes, if you've stuck with me and listened to these, basically cover all I really have or want to say about my life up to this point. From here on out, I'm more interested in going in the direction of an intellectual consideration and possibly intellectual criticism. I'm a very deep reader, and I want to start writing really about the books that I'm reading. And it's really context about the moment of what I'm discovering as I read. And that's where this is going to go. What's beautiful about this is that I can always draw on personal experience. And of course, that's going to add a flourish to these essays. But I'm not going to focus on the starting point of some kind of memory. And that's also where this essay was so informative to me. It took me a while to write it because I've been busy working on my novel. But as I kept coming around this essay over and over, I kept going back to Jack Kerouac's sentence where, he describes, and again, I'm going to open this up. Let me read it one more time so that you can hear it, because this is the discovery that I've made with this essay and what I'm going to do with the podcast, is that I had just gotten over a serious illness and I won't bother to talk about, except that it had something to do with the miserably weary split up and my feeling that everything was dead. Now, that's quite a heavy sentence. I'm actually thinking in a very positive way, but the context of what Kerouac is writing is exactly what I feel about. There are so many things that, I could just get into the weeds on, and I'm not interested in going there because they don't matter. What matters is I'm here, I've arrived, I'm reading better than I ever have, and I'm writing in a way that gets me so excited. I get up in the morning at 3 a.m. and I work between 3 and 7, and then I'm with kids and I've got all kinds of things going on, but all day long I've got this hot little fire burning and I'm feeling something pretty magical with the work, and that's what I'm going to do with this podcast, is focus on the reading aspect and writing the essays that spur from that, and then the novels that are going to come as, that's its own thing. So stay tuned. And in 2021, I already have several outlined. So I'm going to hit the road running, but I need to dedicate the remainder of this year to finalizing my book. One last thing, this is kind of somewhat humorous, tongue-in-cheek, but we, taking the family, we're going to go to Park City for the month of December. And we're going to hole up in the snow and have Christmas in that area. And it's something I've always wanted to do. And so maybe in some ways, I'm not going to turn into Jack Torrance up there. So if Stephen King's listening, that isn't what it's going to be. But it's kind of cool to think the writer is going to be in a winter house for the month of December. So we'll see what that's like. But come January, I anticipate having another podcast here released. So for those that have listened, I appreciate your time. And for those that haven't found me yet, I'm actually looking to you more, believe it or not. It's the people that are going to come about 2 years from now when I've got more of these essays out. And by then I've got my first, possibly second book into the world. And we'll see what comes with that in this coming year. But I'm laying down some tracks right now in what will be their near distant past. And then all of a sudden they're going to go, hey, who's this Russell Cordell Staker guy? But who knows? And I'm not trying to make it sound like some vainglorious attempt. It's just kind of cool to think that I'm putting something down that somebody else is going to find 2-3 years from now. And they're going to go through this and go, wow, that was really cool. So if anything, it's been good for me to do this. So with that, I bid you adieu. And if you get a chance, please check out Michel Polnareff. His last name is spelled Polnareff. Michel, the first name is Michel, and his album from 1966, Love Me, Please Love Me, and the title track is Sur quelle étoile suis-je né? And I'll just say that, but if you look up what I just told you, it's really magical. And then unfortunately, on that album, the second song that I derived the title of this essay, Soul Coaxing, that was a single that came out, as I described in the essay, the following year, called Ame Kaline. But if you look up Soul Coaxing, you can hear the orchestrated version. Get on YouTube and see if you can find him singing that as well. It's absolutely masterful, and he's got a wonderful voice, and he's one of my dad's strange angels, because when I hear him sing, I'm right there again, a little kid, looking up at my dad, listening to him sing with his beautiful voice. So until next time, early 2021, I appreciate you listening, and I look forward to sharing my next essay. Good night. Take good care. Go out and vote, and let's pray for some massive change.